Hello, thanks for having me, and thanks to everyone joining today. While I miss seeing friends in person, the shift to virtual events has had a huge impact on making conferences like ATO more accessible to folks all over the world. And that's actually pretty relevant about what I'm here to talk to you about today. So let's dive in. The amount of software that we, the human race, will rely on in the coming decades will grow exponentially. Our cars will continue to get smarter, software will continue to help us diagnose, treat, and even prevent illnesses. It will help us improve the health of our planet as we develop solutions to combat climate change, food shortages, and resource constraints. And behind all of that is the open source community, a community that, of course, many of you watching today are a critical part of. In order to support this growth, to maintain the software that we already have and create the software of the future, we need the open source community to grow too. We need more developers, more maintainers, and more contributors to meet the ever-increasing demands for software. It's basically more of it all, I guess. And what's amazing is how quickly we're already seeing this happen. So how do we, the existing open source community, support this growth? How do we pave a path for new developers and ensure the innovation and quality of this community continues to grow along with its size? How do we give some of the tireless maintainers out there a much-deserved break? To support the continued growth and health of open source, we need to create an open source culture where anyone can be a contributor and grow to be a maintainer. We need to continue to unleash the network effects of every commit, and perhaps most significantly, we need to enable local and global commercial opportunity through open source. First, let's talk about contributors and the importance of open source development as a viable career path. Today, there are over 50 million developers on GitHub. In 5 years, we expect that number to double. That's 100 million developers who are going to be critical to the acceleration of human progress in the coming decades. They're going to come from all over the world, but especially from developing nations where learning to code and contributing to open source is a path to economic growth and prosperity. This is a map of where in the world contributions on GitHub are happening today. 5 years ago, the majority of open source contributions were being made in the Western world. Over time, we start to see more and more regions growing in terms of contributors. And now you can see that the epicenter of open source contribution is actually moving away from the Western world. As we move into the future, we see places like India, China, Africa, and Latin America really start to light up. Just check out the map. There is an acceleration happening in open source contributions from outside the Western world, and this is going to intensify over the next 5 to 10 years. I'm going to share a stat that still boggles my mind. My son is 7, and in his lifetime, 80% of the world population will reside in Asia and Africa. The developing world is really going to drive a lot of the innovation and progress we're going to see in the next few decades. And the world is going to be richer, more dynamic, and more inclusive because of this interconnected open source community that we're all continuing to build together. Let's zoom into the impact that open source can have on someone's life. This is Sonia John, a blockchain developer, writer, and speaker in Kenya who recently participated in the GitHub README project. She was 25 when hyperinflation hit South Sudan and she lost her job and 90% of her savings. She felt like she'd lost everything and was starting to get desperate. In her own words, she moved to Kenya, bought a cheap laptop and installed Ubuntu, because that's what she had heard programmers do, and taught herself how to code. She didn't have a degree in computer science or an internship with a software company. She had a laptop and she had determination. The first time someone offered to pay her for a project, she just didn't believe it. But she built a messenger bot, earned her first paycheck as a developer, and discovered the enormous opportunity that had opened up to her. Sonia's story is so inspiring. There are brilliant, gifted people all over the world right now who haven't unlocked their potential to contribute to open source. As we look ahead to the dramatic rise in software development that is coming in the next 5 years and beyond, we need to seek out these folks and create a path to open source contribution and, in turn, financial opportunity. We need to make it possible for talented developers to have a thriving, successful career in open source, to get paid for their work, to grow their careers, and contribute their talent to a space where it has the potential to have enormous impact. I'll share some thoughts on some specific ways that you can help with this a bit later. We've seen what kind of opportunity open source can bring to one person. Let's now flip that and look at this from the other perspective. Let's look at the network effect of a single commit to an open source project. For this example, we picked a commit to TensorFlow in June of 2020. This is a real contribution contributed by a single developer. That commit helps improve TensorFlow, which we know is being used widely around the globe. In the 4 months that have passed since it was made, more than 4,500 developers from over 100 countries have worked directly on the TensorFlow project. But this is only the tip of the iceberg. Let's now look at all of the projects that have leveraged and directly depend on this version of TensorFlow. That single commit is now included in about 23,500 projects on GitHub, anchored in 137 countries around the world. And so far, it has been included in the work of more than 50,000 developers from 151 countries. The reach of a single commit is incredible. This is the compounding effect of a single contribution. Think about the exponential impact a single developer can have in their career. Multiply that by 100 million and just imagine what this community can do. It honestly gives me goosebumps to think about the magnitude of what can be achieved. I love this example of just what commit can lead to. This is Evan Yu, another maintainer who participated in the GitHub README project. He started an open source project called Vue with the intention of building a simple JavaScript library that he could reference to improve his own efficiency. He never intended to be a full-time open source maintainer, but you can get where this is going. That's exactly what he does today. When he open sourced the project, people started using it. The community adapted his idea, built on it, and ultimately helped it evolve into a thriving global community of maintainers, contributors, and users. One thing I love about Vue is that Evan's vision for the project is to give any user a low barrier of entry, a good foundation, and room to grow. He said that the ideal user is someone who just got into web development, and they're intentionally designing a way for folks to start building without having an understanding of how front-end development actually works. It's this mindset that can have a huge impact on lowering the barrier of entry for new developers to open source. Vue began with the foundation of a single contributor and has evolved to become an integral part of developer workflows. And best of all, it's now fully funded by the community it serves. I told you about Sonia John earlier, and she said something that I think is so insightful. She said, "When I'm building solutions and decide to keep them closed, I recognize that this removes an opportunity for somebody else. So most of my work is open source." The potential of the community is absolutely massive, and every project, every commit is a building block that the next 50 million developers will be able to learn from and build on. So we all need to focus on getting more people to that first commit, because of course, that's where it all starts. So we've talked about the impact that open source can have on Sonia and other people's lives, and we've talked about the value of a commit. So let's talk a little bit about money. The growth of open source community has real economic impact. According to the Korn Ferry Institute, demand for skilled workers will outstrip supply in the next 10 years, resulting in a global talent shortage of more than 85.2 million people. If left unchecked, the financial impact of this talent shortage could reach more than 8.4 trillion in unrealized annual revenue by 2030. This is equivalent to the combined GDPs of Germany and Japan. Obviously, these numbers are for a broader group than just developers. This is all skilled workers. But an increasing number of these jobs will require technical fluency, if not straight coding skills. Open source will play a key role in closing this gap, and in doing so has the power to help accelerate emerging economies. Let's take a look at one incredibly inspiring program related to this. Laboratoria is a social entrepreneurship program in Latin America that trains women who have been unable to start careers in web development or UX design. The organization then connects these women with companies and helps them launch a career in tech. Since its inception, Laboratoria has trained over 1,600 women, and 78% of them have started technology careers in 17 industries. That kind of success can have a huge impact on a local economy. Here's the story of one woman whose life was changed thanks to Laboratoria. Shareni Azcárraga is from Puebla, Mexico. She had to leave a career in music that she loved. She started walking and training neighbors' dogs to make a living in order to support her family. She applied and was accepted to the Laboratoria training program, where she trained as a UX designer. She's now a web developer who draws on her experience in the arts and in dog training to guide users through a well-orchestrated application experience for the program. I share this story because there are several things that I talked about today that form the bigger picture of the opportunity ahead. We need the next 50 million developers to continue to carry the open source community forward and to create the software we'll all depend on in the future. There is so much untapped talent all over the world, and so many people are seeking opportunities to improve their lives through professional achievement, financially, or often both. That talent has the potential to have lasting, positive impact, not only on the lives of individuals, but on innovation and economic growth, both locally and more broadly. But to get there, we must continue to remove barriers. In Major League Hacking's most recent hacker census, which is a survey of almost 100,000 collegiate hackathon participants, nearly 62% of respondents said that they had not contributed to open source yet. Among them, close to 92% believe that contributing to open source in the future will be important for their career. The main thing holding them back is that they feel like they don't know how to get started or that they aren't skilled enough. Organizations like Laboratoria and the Vue Project are doing amazing work bringing more people into tech and open source and lowering the barriers to getting started. There are so many ways that we can all get involved in paving the way for new developers to join the open source community. I picked a few great examples, but this is far from an exhaustive list. Google Summer of Code, which I'm sure virtually all of you have heard of by now, is a program focused on bringing more student developers from around the world to open source. Outreachy organizes 3-month paid internships with free and open source software projects for people who are typically underrepresented in those projects. Open Collective gives open source projects a transparent way to collect funding and manage their finances. Community Bridge brings together project maintainers, contributors, and users to fund open source projects, improve code security, and boost the size and diversity of open source communities. Of course, at GitHub, we have GitHub Sponsors, which enables companies and individuals to sponsor projects or specific developers, making open source careers possible for contributors. I'd encourage everyone to consider sponsoring an individual or a team that's doing work that's important to you. The Major League Hacking Fellowship provides educational curriculum and practical experience that new developers can put on their resumes right away. Companies can sponsor fellows to work on specific projects within their organization or open source projects in general to help more people enter into careers as developers. These projects and platforms are always seeking supporters, financial sponsors, and mentors to fuel their growth. So I encourage you to get involved in one or more if you're not already, whether that's shining a light on the incredible work that they do, supporting them financially, or acting as a mentor for folks going through their programs. In addition, think about the global nature of the developer community. Build your projects and your communities with the needs of developers around the world in mind. Do you need to change anything for your software to be useful for folks in emerging economies and mobile-first markets? What about places without fast internet? What about your community? Is it welcoming to new developers, those from different backgrounds and parts of the world? And of course, how do you think about accessibility to be available and useful for as many folks as possible? I know there's lots of food for thought here and a ton of great talks out there by others on details around building our projects and communities to be more inclusive and accessible. So I encourage you to take a look at those. What started with a small group of academics and researchers back in the 50s and 60s and led to the free software movement in the 80s and the launch of the open source movement in the 90s is now a community of 50 million people whose efforts and contributions have helped define the world as we know it today. Because of you, the pace of new software is blazingly fast, with components for almost anything readily available. Because of you, there is an abundance of exceptionally high quality software freely available for everyone to use and to build on. And because of you, people around the world can learn from the vast array of knowledge and best practices shared openly, helping pave the way for new contributors to open source. It took decades to grow the community to this size. With your help, in just the next few years, we'll pave the way for the next 50 million developers so that open source can continue to be a key source of innovation, global collaboration, and an engine of human progress. Here's to being 100 million strong. Thanks for all you do, and thanks for being here today.
Hi, everybody. My name is Shedrack Akintayo, and today I'm going to be talking about open source in Africa. So let's get started. And thank you once again for allowing me to grace this event. It means a lot to me. So let's get started. So like Todd said, I'm Shedrack Akintayo, software developer, I'm developer advocate, and I also double as a technical writer. So let's talk about Africa. I mean, Africa is a continent, not a country. Africa is a continent in the world with various countries in it. Africa is quite populated, have a large number of Black people in Africa. We're about 1.216 billion people as of 2016. I mean, it should be double, it should have increased more by now. Talent. So, I mean, a lot of us have been seeing like different things coming out from Africa, and one of Africa's major export resource is talent. We have various talented designers, developers, and engineers. Now, let's go back, take it back a little bit to GitHub State of the Octoverse 2019. Now, if you look at the chart I just showed now, where open source is growing, we have about 59% growth in Nigeria, which is really, really crazy. We also have about 44% growth in Kenya, and we've had a growth from about 40% in Tunisia and Morocco. And to just show you how much Africa is like, developers from Africa are really doing the whole open source, are really taking open source seriously, we can see that Nigeria has the highest growth in open source. Nigeria is a country in Africa, my home country. So now let's just see a little bit of what GitHub is saying about Africa. So we have about 65% growth in Kenya, in Morocco, Kenya, Nigeria, Egypt, South Africa. I mean, Nigerians, the entire Africa is taking open source up to the next level, and we've had collectively about 70% more contributors this year than last year, which is like a really insane stats for open source. Now let's talk about a certain a community in Nigeria and Africa that is helping to spread the gospel of open source. OSCAR, so Open Source Community Africa. Open Source Community Africa is like a community of creatives driving the open source movement in Africa. It was basically created to encourage more African developers to contribute to open source and also advocate for open source movements in Africa. The most beautiful thing about OSCAR is it is diverse. It provides a community for both designers, for both technical writers, for both developers to come together and contribute to open source. So OSCAR demographics. Just before I move forward, I'm also part of the organizing team for OSCAR. So we are currently in about 5 countries. We have about 11 cities and 1,000 plus members in Africa, and we are about to see more growth in the coming months. So these are like several photos from various meetups that we've had. We've had meetups in Kenya, Zambia, various parts of Africa to sit down and talk about open source. So OSCAR project. So we had the Open Source Festival. We started the Open Source Festival earlier this year in February, and we had like a large number. We have about 800 to 1,000 people coming together from all parts of Africa and also Europe. We had people from Drupal, we had people from GitHub, we had people from Google. We also had sponsorships from Facebook, Google, GitHub, and it was really, really nice to see people coming together to talk about open source here in Africa. We also encourage diversity. Like I said, we also have the Women on Oscar, which is a joint effort with She Code Africa to introduce and train more women and girls into open source. So we also partnered with, Oscar also partnered with Open Collective to create a bounty program so that people that are contributing to open source can also get paid here in Africa while contributing. So there's a certain number of bugs that are available on the Open Collective repo, GitHub repo with bounty tags on it. If you check it out now, you will see it there called with the tag Oscar. And like I said, we have a very diverse communities of both developers and designers. So Open Source Design Africa, this is an effort by the design team of Oscar to help designers also get started in contributing to open source. So connecting with Oscar, do you want to know more about Oscar? You can also check the website, oscar.org. You can also follow them on Twitter and also donate to Oscar on Open Collective. Now, so while we are talking about various communities, we need to talk about certain people that have helped grow the development, can help grow the growth of open source in Africa. So, the very first person I would like to talk about is Samson. So Samson Gordy is also a GitHub star and part of the GitHub README project. He's a software developer who believes in changing the world and is an open source advocate, and is also maintaining Sugar Labs while on the board of directors seats. Oscar is also the co-founder of the Open Source Africa. Samson is also the co-founder of the Open Source Africa, and he currently works with the UN and UN Women to bring more women into technology. Next person is Ada. So Ada, she's the founder of She Code Africa. She trains girls and provides a community for girls to learn and women to learn how to write code. She's also the co-founder of Open Source Africa. She's also a developer advocate at Google. So in February 2020, she and her team hosted about 1,000+ Africa developers to the largest open source event here in Africa, tagged the Open Source Festival, like I said. The next person is Prosper. So Prosper is an open source advocate, he's an evangelist, and the CTO of Eden Life Inc. He's one of the pioneers, the key pioneers of open source movement in Africa here. He's a regular speaker at developer events around the world. One very insane stat that helped Nigeria get recognized as one of the people pushing for the open source movement. In 2016, Prosper beat out top companies like Facebook to trend #2 on GitHub. Only Google was above him on the list of trend developers. I mean, Google is a whole organization, and Prosper is just a single person that was able to top other companies like Facebook and etc. in the list of trending developers, which is like a big win for Africa. I think it was during this time that companies outside Nigeria, outside Africa, began to take a shift towards seeing what we are doing here in Africa. The next person is Abigail. So Abigail is a product designer and an open source design avocado, an advocate. She has over various years of experience, combined experience in technology, focusing on web and product design. She also is a speaker here at the All Things Open. Very excited to see her talk, and she loves open source and is passionate about helping people learn how to grow as open source contributors. She basically pushes for more designers to go into open source. And if you have noticed over the years, a lot of people think that just pushing open source is just for developers, but Abigail here is trying to change the narrative that even designers can contribute to open source. And Marlene is a Zimbabwean explorer. She's a speaker, and she's from a city of Harare in Zambia. She's also an advocate for for science and technology for social good. She's currently the director and the vice chair for the Python Software Foundation, and also on the chair of Python Africa. She's currently pursuing a computer science degree with the University of London. Marlene has over a very good number of years contributing to open source and also providing a community for developers to get into open source, and including designers.
Yeah, sir.
The next is Segun Adebayo. I mean, a lot of people from a lot of people from around the world do not know Segun Odebayo is the creator of Chakra UI. So Chakra UI is a very popular React component library that helps you create accessible websites and apps with speed. On GitHub, the project is hosted on GitHub. It has about 10,000, about over 10,000 stars, which is really, really great. And it's one of the biggest projects, open source project that's come out of Africa. He's also a design engineering manager at tradelink.com. He also co-founded Career Lift. Segun is a very, very big open source advocate here in Africa. When he started Chakra UI, we saw how Chakra UI grew from just having 1 star to having over 10,000 stars and having recognition from all over the world with people like Kent, very big open source players in the world using Chakra UI and giving very great feedback about it. We are proud of him here in Africa, and we are looking so forward to see more stuff, more open source projects from him and other people. So notable open source projects and communities from Africa. Like I said, Chakra UI, a very, very huge React component library with a lot of people using it all around the world. And we have Image AI. This is like an artificial intelligence project by Moses. Moses is I think he's currently software engineer at Microsoft here in Nigeria. The project has about 5,000 stars on GitHub and has a lot of people using it. Then Danfo.js is it's a JavaScript library for data structures, for presenting data in structures, etc. Made in Nigeria. So Made in Nigeria is a GitHub repo that consists of most of the open source projects that has come out of Nigeria. It's a community of open source developers here in Nigeria and designers here in Nigeria. We share their project, and the project is currently hosted on GitHub, and you can always like find out and by clicking the link. So I attach the links to every single point project that I'm dropping here. Code for Africa. So Code for Africa is a community where people come together to talk, to teach people how to code, from children to women to just basically if you want to get into coding and also open source. Code for Africa is there for Africans. Open source community Africa, like I said, I spoke about open source community. Africa is one of the largest open source communities we have here in Africa that is trying to change the narrative of how people see open source here in Africa. So Material Pay Night team. I purposely put this here because, I mean, a lot of people here, we use VS Code, and Material Pay Night team was created by Olaolu Olawi. He's currently a senior UX developer at Shopify. He built it here here in Nigeria, and it has about 300,000 downloads, which is really, really a very, very good mark for us here in Africa. It's currently hosted on GitHub, and you can always find the link to it. You can use a really, really great team. We had people like Sarah Drasna. We have people very, very big players in the open source talk about Material Pay Night team and how useful it is. We've had various people make certain look-alike teams from the Material Pay Night team. Now, the Free Software and Open Source Foundation for Africa. So it's basically headed by the UN, and it basically brings people from various parts of Africa to come up and learn more about open source and also learn more about coding. Now, how to provide support for OSS in Africa. I think Erica said something generally about how to provide support for people in open source, but I want to like narrow it down to just Africa. We need more people to sponsor, more companies, more organizations, more foundations to sponsor OSS events in Africa. Currently, we've had just Open Source Community Africa pushing for this event. We also need to provide OSS. We also need these companies and organizations and foundations to provide OSS learning supports for people here in Africa. We also need we need more OSS initiatives established here in Africa, because a lot of people are still like lacking behind when it comes to open source. A lot of people still don't understand what it means. So when more initiatives are created for people to see how open source work, a lot of people don't understand it, then we would see a better increase in open source here in Africa. We need more people to provide a voice for African OSS creators and contributors. There are a lot of OSS creators and contributors here in Africa doing great stuff that they are hardly recognized. So we need people to help us reach out to these OSS creators and the contributors here in Africa, get them on interviews to talk about their products, to talk about things they are doing, it will really serve as an incentive for more people to get into open source, because a lot of people feel like they're not appreciated enough because, I mean, they're Africans. But when we provide an enabler environment for people, for OSS creators and contributors, then would have a better increase in open source contributions here in Africa. So one very important is hire more folks from Africa. I mean, we have great people here that are working, that are very intelligent, very brilliant. I mean, when companies come here to Africa to see that we have good people providing open source support, doing a lot of open source contribution, you would see that this will provide a sense of like, okay, this is great. So we can currently start providing more support for people here in Africa, and this will increase the growth of open source here in Africa. I mean, there are a lot of open source companies around the world, so this isn't something that should be that difficult. Also, one very last point is promote open source from Africa. GitHub has been doing a very great job promoting open source here in Africa with the README project. I mean, talking about Sonia, a couple of Africans that Samson, that on the README project. We have Samson, we have Sonia, we have like a number of people from Africa here that GitHub have decided to promote, create a voice for them, more people to hear about their story, etc. So yeah, that's basically it for my talk, for my keynote talk. Thank you everyone for listening, for taking your time to listen to my talk. This means a lot to me, and thank you to the organizers for giving me the opportunity to talk about open source in Africa. I have a talk tomorrow on the international track. If you want to hear more about open source in Africa, you can definitely jump on the talk. Thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you, Tad. Hello, I'm Endu Emuche, IBM Fellow, Cloud Transformation and Engineering. I am really delighted to be here to share some important news around how technology can be leveraged to combat racial inequalities. IBM is a founding partner in Call for Code, the largest tech for good initiative of its kind anywhere in the world. It's a successful global program, which for the past 3 years has been addressing some of the most pressing, intractable, unprecedented, interconnected challenges of our time, including COVID-19, climate change, natural disasters, leveraging the unique ingenuity of more than 400,000 developers in almost 180 nations around the world. Earlier last week, on October 13th, IBM announced Call for Code for Racial Justice. This encourages adoption, incubation, evolution of open source projects to drive progress in 3 important areas. First, police and judicial reform and accountability, diverse representation, policy and legislation reform. Today, I'd like to announce that the Call for Code for Racial Justice team is contributing 5 solution starters to the open source community, really to galvanize, to accelerate that progress towards a more inclusive, equal, equitable world. These 5 solutions cover topics including voting, including incident response reporting, local legislation and policies, and assistance to public defenders. Together with partners such as Black Girls Code and Collab Capital, Call for Code for Racial Justice is inviting developers from around the world, all of you on this conference, to apply your skill sets, your ingenuity, your passion to drive meaningful change around equity and equality. We believe that the open source collaboration model is such a powerful force that can make this sustained meaningful change happen. Now you can learn more about Call for Code for Racial Justice, as well as IBM's perspective on the role of open source technology in diversity and inclusion by attending 2 sessions, today and tomorrow. In one of the sessions, I would actually be a panelist. In the other, I'll be moderating a panel of experts on this topic. You could also visit the IBM digital booth to learn more. Now, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Brad Topel, to share some additional news and information. Thank you very much. Brad?
Thank you, Endu. I'm Brad Topel, IBM's Distinguished Engineer for Open Technology and Developer Advocacy, and I have some very exciting announcements. First, join me tomorrow for my moderated theater presentation at 2:30 p.m., where I will be announcing the Call for Code Regional Award winner and also giving a very fun presentation on Kubernetes, and we'll have 2 free book links as well. But I do have a big announcement for today, and that is the IBM Open Source Community Grant. The IBM Open Source Community Grant is an effort by IBMers to take action and to have a positive impact on open source by driving efforts to create and sustain a more diverse technology workforce. The grant awards $25,000 in cash and $25,000 in IBM Cloud credits. I had the honor of announcing the first ever IBM Open Source Community Grant Award last year on stage at All Things Open. And we awarded this grant quarterly ever since. Now, for the winner of this quarter's IBM Open Source Community Grant is Black Girls Code. Black Girls Code's mission is to increase the number of women of color in the digital space by empowering girls of color ages 7 to 17 to become innovators in STEM fields, leaders in their communities, and builders of their own futures through exposure to computers and technology. IBM is powering their mission with $25,000 in cash and $25,000 of IBM Cloud credits. We couldn't be happier to help them in their mission. And if you have an open sourced focused nonprofit that you would like to be under consideration for an IBM open source grant, please contact an IBMer who's working in your open source community to nominate you. And once again, congratulations to Black Girls Code.
It's great to be here, everyone. So hello and good morning. My name is Wendy John, and I'm the head of Global Diversity and Inclusion at Fidelity Investments. And my pronouns are she, her, and hers. I'm thrilled to be joining you today from my home in the state of North Carolina, although I'm sure we all would love to be in the convention center. But this opportunity, taking it virtual, allows many others who would not have been able to attend in person to join in with us. Before you think I've stumbled into the wrong Zoom webinar, I wanted to clarify that yes, you heard that right. I'm here from Fidelity Investments. You may be wondering what in the world a D&I leader from a financial services company is doing amongst the inspiring open source speakers you'll hear from this morning. And the first reason is this: we are not just a FinServ company. We also like to think of ourselves as a technology company. We spend billions annually on technology. That spend covers everything from customer platforms to tools that help us collaborate, to building virtual reality experiences to help onboard new employees. Firm-wide, 25% of our employees work in technology. And in North Carolina, home to All Things Open, 60% of our employees are technologists. You heard me right. 60% of my fellow colleagues in North Carolina are not financial advisors, not customer service reps, but people like you who build technology. We pride ourselves on having an innovation culture built around continuous development and a growth mindset. Our employees participate in our blockchain club, join our Women in Technology Special Interest Group, and get involved with Fidelity Labs, our incubation lab for new ideas. We have a long history of investing in the cutting edge with recent commitments around cryptocurrency and blockchain, and exciting collaborations like our quantum computing efforts with AWS. Fidelity is always creating. In fact, we hold 259 patents on a variety of topics, a great testament to our consistent focus on innovation. One area specifically around open collaboration is our work to release more of our machine learning efforts as open source. These have been focused on making common algorithms available and also for creating more simplified interfaces for frameworks like TensorFlow and PyTorch. You'll hear more about our open source approach and efforts from my colleagues Justin Ratcliffe and Sachin Solkan in their respective sessions at All Things Open. Okay, so now we know why Fidelity is here today. But what does inclusion and diversity have to do with technology, and more specifically, open source? Everyone attending today's event is on the hook for co-creating something innovative. You sit on teams and manage projects that create tools and platforms that improve people's lives, maybe even in ways they haven't asked for yet. The connection between diversity and inclusion, innovation and profitability has been proven. Here are a few data points to ground us all. McKinsey's 2019 analysis found that companies in the top quartile for gender diversity on executive teams were 25% more likely to have above average profitability. And this goes even further for ethnic diversity, where companies in the top quartile of ethnic diversity outperform others by 36%. And this holds true for times of uncertainty like we're in right now. Several reports showed that in 2008's global financial crisis, banks with a higher share of women on their boards were more stable than their peers. Although we all know that diversity and inclusion is important, technology and other industries like financial services remains largely white and male. Since June of this year, there's been a larger spotlight on the importance of diversity and inclusion. There's tremendous energy around these topics and how it applies in all that we do. People want to take action, but often don't know where to start. It's the same problem that has stalled this work for decades. Sometimes it just feels too big to solve. At Fidelity, we approach diversity and inclusion a little differently, with a behaviors-based approach that taps into the science of habit change. We have a concept called simple starts, which prompts our employees to make adjustments to the behaviors and business processes that make up their day-to-day work. By focusing on behaviors within your immediate control, rather than trying to shift an entire organization's culture all at once, we see incremental changes that add up significantly over time. Our concept may be called simple starts, but there's nothing simple about the work of diversity and inclusion. It's a complicated, ingrained problem that can't be solved overnight. Getting started, though, can be a lot simpler with some of the ideas that I'll share with you today. I'm going to cover a few simple starts in 3 distinct categories: team management and dynamics, everyday pivots, and of course, technology. Since open source is all about coming together on collaborative teams to create and build, let's start with team management and dynamics. Here are a few simple behavioral changes you can implement on your teams today. Rotate work assignments on your team regularly, including team housework like note-taking or meeting scheduling, and higher profile projects versus only going to the well-known few members of your team. Set team members up with mentors or sponsors with different backgrounds to expand their view of the world. Encourage participation or development of employee resource groups or ERGs. At Fidelity, we have 6 ERGs and 4 special interest groups. More than half of our employees participate in at least one of these groups, and some participate in 3 or more. Consider starting affinity groups if your organization does not yet have them. These groups provide ready access to diverse thoughts and perspectives. They can serve as focus groups, talent pools, and/or business partners in your work. Audit the membership of your team. Seek participation and contribution from a diverse set of people. And when an underrepresented person leaves your team, dig into understanding the why, in case there are changes that need to be made. Reconsider your team participation criteria. Balance the need for specific skills like coding, which can be taught, with the value of fresh perspectives, which might be impossible to teach. At Fidelity, we have a few programs focused on non-traditional sources of talent in technology. Fidelity Made introduces associates from traditionally non-technical roles in the enterprise to apply their business experience to tech problems. And we partner with ReachHire to provide career paths for a diversity of life situations. Now let's talk about everyday pivots. These are changes that everyone can make, regardless of their role on a team or in an organization, to be more inclusive. And they span across work life and home life. It's difficult to influence one without the other. And what's the difference, especially these days? You're here with me in my home. Language matters, so pay careful attention to the words you use. Use pronouns in your introductions to create safety for others to share how they identify. Use more inclusive terms. For example, stop using guys as a way to refer to mixed groups of people and look for something that might be a little more gender neutral, like folks. We use that a lot here in the South of US. Capitalize the B in Black in your writing when referring to Black people or communities. For the open source community, eliminate terminology like whitelist, blacklist, or master slave, and consider alternatives for other gendered language. Monitor your information diet. This means paying careful attention that the books you read, podcasts you listen to, and the shows you view aren't all created by people with the same backgrounds or perspectives. Demand a seat at the table and bring someone new along with you where or when possible. For the women in the audience, make sure you're representing the work you've done. Don't be shy or self-deprecating when sharing your accomplishments. Overall, exposing ourselves to new thoughts, ideas, approaches, and people makes us all better. And as a result, we create better products and solutions. And last, but certainly not least, technology. The good news is that due to advancements developed by technologists like you, we, the humans, don't have to do this all on our own. Here are a few ways we can use tech to help us create more diverse and inclusive workplaces. Use artificial intelligence to audit the language in job descriptions. At Fidelity, we run our jobs through a tool that scans for biased language. It takes about 6 minutes per role, but has greatly improved the number of female applicants we receive. Meet diverse people where they are. Implement processes that post all of your open jobs to a variety of diverse online job boards. Remember that data isn't the end all and be all. My friend and leading AI ethicist and AI activist, Renee Cummings, reminded us in a recent talk at Fidelity that there's no such thing as raw data. The data points we use to build technology often comes with built-in bias because it originates from an environment where racism is systemic and stereotypes have been baked in for centuries. Ensure you're evaluating all of the components into your technology solutions for bias and engage diverse stakeholders throughout. You'll hear more from another of my colleagues, Melinda Thielbar, on our approach to AI bias and mitigation at Fidelity. Invest in places to come together online. Of course, the open source community has been practicing true online collaboration for years, for example, at the Linux Foundation. COVID-19 has exemplified the importance of creating virtual spaces for people to gather and share ideas. Ensure these online spaces are accessible and open to all, using tools like live closed captioning. As I shared those 3 categories, doesn't it sound a lot like people, processes, and technology, a framework many of you are already familiar with? I hope that these simple starts I shared today can help you and your teams get started. If you've already started, perhaps I've given you a few new ways to continue the journey. It can be easy to let the problem paralyze you, that analysis paralysis we all know. Our country's diversity and inclusion challenges may feel too big to solve if you zoom out. So focus on zooming in and get started. Zoom in and shift from trying to change the world or your company to changing 3 to 4 behaviors on the teams where you contribute. Progress against diversity and inclusion is a lot like open source in that way. Most of us will not unveil a shiny new product or solution to the problem. This is something we will all build together, right out in the open, bringing the best of ourselves to contribute. And the first few attempts might not be perfect, but with some iteration, we can create transparent solutions that amount to real change. Thank you all for the time and enjoy the rest of this year's All Things Open.
So I'm first of all very grateful for Todd. I think it might have been 2007 was my first year presenting at what was then called POSCON and has since become All Things Open. Todd has been very gracious in the past of asking for my opinion on things as to what he should do to make this event even better. And fortunately, he has not heeded any of my suggestions, which is why All Things Open is as fantastic as it is today, and he's just done an amazing job. I want to talk a little bit and appreciate Todd and the other speakers that we've had so far I want to talk a little bit about open source in the cloud, which has been a contentious issue in the past. But in the spirit of the people who have already spoken, I don't want to talk about it from a contentious angle. I want to talk about it in the spirit of partnership. But I'm going to start with something that might sound a little contentious, and that is in a conversation that I had not too long ago with a colleague of mine, Matt Wilson. He made the observation that most enterprise software is garbage. He might not have used the word garbage, but he said, we talked about why enterprise software is so incredibly bad. And his suggestion was that the reason for that ultimately comes down to the fact that the vendors of the software are not the ultimate users of the software. And the closer we could get, and this goes back to something that now IBM president, then Red Hat CEO, Jim Whitehurst said back in 2009, which was, we have so much waste in the software industry. We really need end users. There's not a great word for that, but let's say end users or customers, also not a great way of expressing it, but end users of software. We need more end users of software contributing to open source so that instead of reinventing the wheel, we can collaborate. So that's what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about how we get there and how we bring down the wall between open source and cloud. Because there's been this myth that's surfaced over the last few years, and that is that in some way, cloud and open source are in contention, are in conflict. And I would argue the opposite is true. Recently, in a new Stack series that I wrote, and I got so much great feedback from people on Twitter and quote unquote in real life, that said, the cloud would not be possible without open source. And I think that's true. I think it might have been Erica who started this day off, who said it really, I mean, part of it comes down to economics, but it's not really a matter of economics. It's really a matter of how would you count up all the licenses if you're thinking of thousands or tens of thousands or millions of servers? How do you do that? With open source, you don't really have to think about that. With traditional enterprise software, proprietary software, you did. And it makes it such that the cloud would be, if not impossible, and I would argue impossible, at least extraordinarily difficult. And Chris DeBona, who I think is speaking tomorrow, made that contention years ago that Google would not be possible without open source. So we know that the cloud enables, or that open source enables the cloud. But I want to talk a little bit about how the cloud is enabling open source. So, and as part of that, a good friend of mine, Sam Ramji, who's now Chief Strategy Officer at DataStax, used to be the open source guy back when that was a thing at Microsoft, but that was a long time ago. Now open source is everybody's thing at Microsoft. Sam likes to say, if you want to go fast, go alone. But if you want to go far, go together. It's not his saying, but he says it a lot. So I want to talk about that. And I'm also going to talk about Pi, in part because at that first POSCon, All Things Open that I spoke at, Todd fed us all, because Todd's like that. It's that Southern hospitality, but also because I like to bake pie. So we're going to talk a little bit about Pi. When you think of the biggest contributors to open source, I'd be interested, and we can't take a poll here and ask everybody, but I'd be interested who you think of when you think of that. When I say the biggest contributor that you can think of to open source, keep it in your mind. I'm pretty sure you're thinking of a cloud vendor right now. And if you are, if you're playing your odds of the top 10 open source contributors, 7 of those top 10 are cloud vendors. And I use the term cloud a little bit loosely. I shouldn't say vendors, I should say cloud companies, because in that number is Facebook, for example. In that group is Amazon. In that group is Google, Microsoft, Red Hat /IBM, but also other companies. There are a few other companies that don't fit that cloud label, like Intel, for example, but Intel does a fair amount to enable the cloud with chips and other software. But think about that. Why would that be that the vast majority, if you tally up the biggest contributors in terms of raw contributors to open source, why would they be cloud companies? And I think if you step back for a second, it's a little bit obvious why that would be the case. It's because cloud companies don't really have anything to lose by contributing software. They don't sell software. Facebook doesn't sell software. AWS or Amazon doesn't sell software. We sell services. So the software itself can be given away. And if we look again at the things that have come out of the different cloud companies, amazing software like Kubernetes that came out of Google. This is the sort of thing that the cloud enables, because it takes away the competitive need to keep software proprietary. So if you run some sort of calculus as to contributes equals to benefits, well, it also makes sense that the cloud companies would be big contributors because we're benefiting a great deal from open source. And I want to talk about that. But really, I want to get away a bit from talking about the big companies behind open source. And I want to talk about the people behind open source and how people are making software, open source software, better in the cloud. And the first person I want to talk about is Dries Beitert, a friend of mine who much more importantly to you as to why he's important, he's the founder of Drupal. But that's not how Dries started. When he started Drupal, he didn't start Drupal. He was looking for a way to share a quote unquote high speed ADSL internet connection as a student in Belgium. And he and his friends were just looking to build a bulletin board. Well, that little bulletin board evolved into Drupal, which last year, or for the last major release, had 10,000 different contributors to the project. It's an amazing example of open source success. But getting from Dries and his friends to Dries and 10,000 of his friends, and by the way, Dries, so he started a company called Acquia, and Acquia, despite being the largest single contributor to Drupal, accounted for less than 5% of those total contributions to the last release. So how did he get from one person to 10,000? Well, along the way in 2000, Dries, in a conversation that I had with him, he said in 2000, they were really struggling to scale Drupal. And part of that was MySQL. MySQL is a great open source database, but he was struggling with all the, as he said, the hundreds of knobs that he had to fiddle with to get it to scale. Circa 2006, AWS launches, and suddenly that, in his words, that became dramatically easier. And he says, you have no idea the change that it made for Drupal in enabling them to scale it. So on the one hand, thinking about cloud, one thing that cloud does is that it makes it so that individual open source entrepreneurs, and entrepreneur, I don't mean that they necessarily start a business. I just mean that they start a project. An open source entrepreneur finds it dramatically easier to start and scale their project. It's one thing that the cloud does. Another example, a more recent example, is Matt Klein with Envoy. Envoy is this fantastic open source project that Matt started as an engineer at Lyft. In Matt's words, when he started the Envoy, it started off just as an internal project. They were trying to move from a monolith-based architecture to a microservices-based architecture, and so he and his team created Envoy. Great, but then they decided, well, maybe we should open source this. And in Matt's words, he did this in part because he thought it'd be good for his career. Lyft did it in part because they thought it'd be great for recruiting. But it was an example of an individual person, Matt, deciding that he wanted to open source this thing and then taking it out. Now, it's become this great service mesh that a lot of different people use, but it started as him scratching an itch for Lyft. And thinking about it in terms of, we're seeing, again, coming back to that idea of the best software will emerge from those who use the software. In Dries's case, it was Dries starting it to share internet access at a university in Belgium. In Matt's case, it was him sharing the software that would enable Lyft to get a higher return on their investment in Envoy. But they built it to support cloud native applications at Lyft. Incidentally, I asked Matt recently, why don't we see more user-driven open source and user-driven open source? And I try not to swear, so I won't quote him verbatim, but he said, it's because it's so effing hard. And he said, but for my naivete, I never would have done this. But we're grateful that he did. And now today, we have this great open source project. And by the way, if you look at the contributors to it, at least 40%, roughly 40% of that code contributed to Envoys coming from Google. And so we see the cloud contributing back to what it's created. I'm going to go to one more example. And this is Madeline Olson. And it's the story of Redis. But that story starts not with Madeline, it starts with Salvatore Sanfilippo, who was the founder of Redis. And when Salvatore started Redis, he did it, this also has another MySQL angle. He did it not because he really wanted to start build a new database. He had no experience with database. He says, I had no idea what I was getting into. I broke all the rules on database design. No one really would take an in-memory database seriously at the time, but he did it anyway, and he started it. One thing that it didn't have was encryption built in. So Madeline is an engineer on the Elasticache team at AWS, and I think roughly 2 years ago, she and her manager decided, hey, you know what? We depend in significant part on Redis. We should contribute back. Well, you don't just walk into Mordor, and you don't just walk into an open source project and take over that project. So Madeline started small, and in her words, she continued to be a relatively small contributor. She did things like enable greater communication by starting a Slack channel for Redis contributors. She did other things like preparing other people's contributions to help them pass muster with Salvatore. And she did one thing that she didn't get actually her code accepted by Salvatore, but she came up with the idea of how to get encryption built into Redis. And Yossi Gottlieb, one of the contributors, and Salvatore reviewed it, decided that they didn't want to take her code, but liked the approach. And so they used that approach and built their own code. But it was little contributions like that earned her goodwill with the team. And then recently, when Redis decided, or the Redis Salvatore decided to leave Redis to go pursue other things, they came up with a new governance structure, and Madeline was asked to be one of the 5 maintainers, along with 3 folks from Redis Labs and Zhao Zhao from Alibaba. It's a great story of how an individual working at a cloud company, because it was solving a particular cloud companies are scratching our itch, how she went from a small contributor to now a significant maintainer. But I think it also says a great deal about how open source can work in the cloud. So here you start with Salvatore, who, by the way, I wish I looked like Salvatore, these rugged good looks, kind of looks like Michael Hutchence, the former lead vocalist for NXS. Salvatore, if you're listening, man crush on you. But you look at what it went from Salvatore to Redis Labs starting to help fund the development of Redis, to where we are today with Redis Labs continuing to fund a significant amount of the development around Redis, but also a number of cloud vendors building managed Redis services around Redis. It's a fantastic example. And you say, well, surely this has cratered Redis Labs revenue. I'm not privy to their numbers, and I wouldn't divulge them if I were. But in my conversations with them, and they're a great partner of AWS, they're doing really, really well. It turns out that sharing code and sharing and growing a pie is a good strategy. So let's talk about pie, because like I said, I really like pie and bake a lot of pie. Let's do some pie related math. So Gartner said that in 2020, even with COVID, global IT spending should top about $3.9 trillion, a lot of money. Cloud, and we spend a lot of time talking about cloud and like figuring out who's winning in the cloud wars. Well, it's a relatively small piece of that overall pie, 266 billion. It's significant money, but in the grand scheme of things, it's a really small pie. I was an English major, and so I'm not necessarily great at math, but I think what that means is that when we spend time agonizing and fighting over who's winning in the cloud and who's is cloud chewing into open source, et cetera, we're fighting over 6% of that global IT spend, which is a little ridiculous. Now, we could say that, well, you know, we've been conditioned to think about in this way we're conditioned to think about small pie. Martin Mikos is a good friend, and about 15 years ago when he was CEO of MySQL, he's now CEO of HackerOne. But when he was CEO of MySQL, and he came up with this great quote saying, in open source, he wanted to take a big market, make it smaller, and then take a big chunk of that market. And we're kind of used to thinking about when we talk about open source, that like saving money, and we talk about cloud, we talk about it in the same way. And so we end up with this little small pie. It's a cute pie. That's my strawberries and cream pie that I like to make, but it's a small pie, and I like pie. So I don't really want small pie. So I had this conversation with Simon Wardley. Many of you know Simon, and I think I'm sure he's spoken here before. In fact, I think I've heard him speak at All Things Open before. He introduced me to this idea of Jevons paradox. And in a nutshell, that idea is we normally think that when we save money, when unit costs go down, that the overall pie is going to shrink, that the market will shrink because people will spend less money because they'll pocket those savings and move on. Turns out that's not how things work in real life. When we save money on our cloud spend, because of our cloud spend, we end up spending more. When we save more by moving to Postgres, we end up spending more on databases or on other services around it. So the way that I read that is that instead of the lower unit costs that cloud and open source together bring us, instead of that turning into less pie, it turns into more. The pie isn't shrinking, it's getting bigger. And by the way, that applies too to the open source companies. I saw just last week that Databricks, I think they actually announced this, that they are now on a $350 million run rate selling managed Spark and other open source software. Well, guess what? Databricks has healthy competition from my company and from others, and they're doing great, in part because a variety of contributors are growing that pie. Look at MongoDB, doing phenomenally well. I think roughly 500 million in revenue now, almost half of which, getting close to half of which, comes from their cloud service, Atlas, which is fantastic. And you go down the list, Confluent recently, well, last year, raised money on a huge valuation, doing really, really well in terms of revenue. Elastic, the same thing, Redis Labs, DataStax, HashiCorp, all these open source companies doing really well. And I would argue they're doing really well precisely because they've embraced cloud. And early on, we had some friction because over licensing gymnastics, but I think that was just a moment in time. I think it was just, it gave us time, until we got to the point where we realized the cloud is not competitive to open source. It's an enabler for open source. It makes it so that end users can focus more time on getting work done rather than on doing the undifferentiated heavy lifting of setting up and managing infrastructure. It's a really good thing what we have now. I want to end with somebody who I think is extraordinarily smart, Adam Jacob. He was the co-founder and CTO at Chef, and now the co-founder of System Initiative. And he talks about cloud and open source in this way. He says, you can think of it as competitive, or you can think of it as a way of growing that overall, the top of funnel, or again, in my words, growing the pie. And I remember having this conversation with a friend that I had worked with when I was at MongoDB. And we were at reInvent, AWS reInvent, back when we were able to go and talk to people in person. And it just struck me at that time that we, those two companies, but in general, we were wasting a lot of time fighting over relatively small pieces of pie, and that it would be much better for each of us to go out and build that pie, contribute to that upstream open source project. And we've seen that at my company. We've seen that with most recently with Redis, but also GraphQL and a number of other projects. And if you look across those cloud companies, people are doing, I think, a pretty good job of doing that. We've had to figure it out over time, but my sense is that there's this great opportunity for all of us to build these open source pies, open source communities together. We need to be a little bit patient with each other. It's easy to make accusations and assume that we know what other people are thinking. We assume we know why they do the things that they do, whether on an individual level or on a macro level, on a company level. I just ask that we be a little bit more thoughtful of each other, and that we remember open source is ultimately about community. It's ultimately about people. It's ultimately about enabling those people. And as we do that, we do something that makes me really happy, and that is we grow the open source pie. Thank you very much. And Todd, again, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.